Hi y'all, thank you for coming. This presentation, Boundaries Within Engineers Without Borders and the Impacts of Team Organizational Culture on Project Design, is the first product of over a year's worth of research that the members of this club have been so gracious to contribute their time and voices to. Throughout this presentation, you will hear and see the words of your peers. They have been anonymized, but part of doing research at home means that you may know whose words are contributing to this presentation. So please, out of respect for our peers, keep this to yourself unless they are your words and you would like to say more. Next, I would like to acknowledge and affirm that the land I am presenting from in Washington, D.C. is the land of the Nacotchunk and Piscataway peoples. I hope this work honors the work of Indigenous scholars in decolonizing knowledge production systems and development projects everywhere. This presentation will start with some background, including an explanation of my methods, methodology, and how I came to ask the questions that this research asks. Then I'll discuss the aspects of engineering culture that frame my findings before going into those in more detail. And I will conclude with an analysis of 3 structural constraints that I argue are crucial in preventing a more holistic incorporation of non-technical factors in our project design processes. I also believe that these structural constraints are where we may be able to implement some interventions to make our projects better. As a member of EWB myself, this research uses an applied methodology known as critical participatory action research. What this methodology acknowledges is that research is reciprocal. I am learning and creating knowledge through continuous dialogue with the EWB community I have become a part of. Therefore, with this collaborative dialogue, I seek to enable and help progress the change members desire. Overall, it appears that the hope is to create a club less influenced by exploitative service learning projects and more influenced by decolonial practices and pedagogies. Y'all have witnessed, participated in, and discussed this research with me for over a year. During this time, I have been enacting this methodology through observation and participation, and critically reflecting upon my own experiences in order to practice what Sandra Harding calls strong objectivity. Strong objectivity can best be understood as the laying bare of my own subjective experiences as a researcher, so others may have as much information as possible to interpret my findings on their own. I hope as I go through this process, you interpret some findings with me, and I'd love to hear your feedback. In a few moments, I hope you will watch as I enact this practice. But before that, I'll give a brief overview of this study's methods. As many of you know, and many of you participated in, I sent out a quantitative survey last quarter. In total, I received 42 responses, some from each of the project teams. The purpose of the survey was to look for a relationship between cultural education and perceptions of cultural knowledge and non-technical project factors. The qualitative portion of this research took place between spring 2020 and December of 2020. I conducted 12-hour-long semi-structured interviews with members from each international project team and 1 undecided new member. I am still coding and analyzing this data, so what you'll see today is just a small picture. Additionally, I engaged in what's known as autoethnography to provide descriptions of my own experiences and to contextualize my research questions. So, why this project? I heard about EWB and became interested for the first time for the same reason that my findings have indicated many of you have: the opportunity to gain experience abroad and the opportunity to help. I was just going to do it a little bit differently than y'all. Initially, I planned to research how the communities we work with understand our projects and their place in them. This would have involved traveling with the team, but then, summer 2019, travel was canceled. I officially joined the team in fall 2019 and was asked to take over the cultural sub-team since it had been empty for over a year. I did and plan to use what I was researching for my senior project to help educate the team. But then COVID-19 hit, and understandably, travel was canceled again. At this point, almost 2 years since I initially thought of this project, and with a much deeper understanding of what it means to be an anthropologist, I decided to turn my focus onto us. With the understanding that researching the members of EWB would 1, still lend itself to better development practices, and 2, not require any additional labor from our community. So that's how I got here. Now I want to walk you all through the development of my research questions. I started pretty broad. How do Engineers Without Borders participants understand the intent and purpose of the co-curricular development projects they work and participate in. Then I got a little bit more narrow. How do members of EWB understand the importance of non-technical factors to their projects? Then, with an additional question of, how does this understanding impact the outcomes of their work? However, I felt like it wasn't quite enough, and that there was still larger influences at play than what individual members believed, so I did what cultural anthropologists do. I took another step back to get a big picture of the broader cultural forces shaping what I was seeing and experiencing in my research, and I finally landed on the question I'm discussing today. How do disciplinary boundaries within engineering influence the organizational structure of Engineers Without Borders here at Cal Poly, and how in turn does this impact team project design? Okay, so now I want to tell you guys a story. It's a compilation of field notes documenting my experiences that I have had in the club as the lead for a non-technical sub-team, but details and such have been changed as a measure of care. As you listen, think about how these experiences inform my research question. It's new member introductions, and we are going around and saying our majors. I, of course, say anthropology and geography. Then, already expecting confusion about my place here, add on with a concentration in international development. I've been asked before what I'm doing in an engineering club, and I try to explain it, but I've learned that adding my concentration alleviates that burden of being questioned. My role is also questioned, and, at times, forgotten. The words, "Wait, before we split up, the cultural team has a presentation," have frequently left my mouth. My role began with education about the community we work with, their customs, food, language, economy, politics, history, etc. Then I took a step back, and this all felt superficial. Those are manifestations of culture, but how was I helping to show that culture is everything and reproduced in everything? Our thoughts, technologies, organization, project processes. So I started presenting about development as a discourse, its histories and theories, and the implications of that for our work. I think that felt a little deeper, but a feeling of disconnect still lingered after each presentation, when our 2 or 3 person team would be sent to our own corner of the room, or later on breakout rooms on Zoom. What was this disconnect? Eventually, I became the go-to person for surveys and materials for the communities, tasked with wording something to get the best outcome, to find out what the design teams wanted to know. I was supposed to be the expert in translation, from technical language to non-technical language. But from the confines of my sub-team breakout room, I never learned the technical. So I tried to foster collaboration, to cross over to the technical world, to learn their language. But when I would join these technical sub-teams, I was sometimes dismissed, told, "This can wait, we have important things to get done." And I was relegated to wait until the technical work was allocated and the team lead was free. But I wanted the input of the entire sub-team. I wanted collaboration. Eventually, as designs emerged more concretely, I started making small design recommendations, or questioning how something might work given the climate, environment, or social patterns of our community. I was seemingly listened to, and my knowledge given credence, but weeks later, when reviewing the project, there were the elements I had suggested against. Not changed, not altered. I didn't say anything, questioning my own ability to participate in any technical work, and questioning the importance of the cultural condition that drove me to make that suggestion in the first place. Meetings with our advisor, a non-engineer as well, always bring complicated feelings. She will bring up the point I made weeks ago. Is that feeling validation of my knowledge? The team will say, "That's a really great point." Is that feeling anger at my almost identical statements being ignored? Or is it self-doubt at my inability to communicate? Conversations I've had with our advisor tell me she asks herself the same questions I do. Do they really hear us? It almost seems like we each have to say something twice, regardless of how urgent our message is, for it to be heard. Eventually it gets through, but first it has to make it across the borders between sub-teams, up the ladder to the project managers, and back down to the sub-team leads. What I experience is never outright dismissal, rudeness, or ambivalence. I've enjoyed my time on the team and made great friends with these people and my peers. And if it is those things, it's almost immediately apologized for. It is usually more subtle, though, and eventually I can push through, but there's a continuous effort to break out of our breakout room, especially since time with the larger group has been cut due to time constraints and design changes, many of which I could be avoided if we all talked more. This effort takes energy and time and occasionally an emotional toll. recently, following the immediate validation of my design critique, the reasons behind the disconnect I feel and experience hit me quite clearly. And it is coming from two places. One, not feeling as if I had the knowledge to participate in design. And two, no one, including myself, really knowing exactly how culture and what culture could do other than educate and build competency. Because here, and in many places, culture is seen as something that influences rather than something that builds. I hope this synthesis of field notes allows for a deeper contextualization of my research, which I will begin presenting now. To start with the shared understanding, I want to discuss some concepts that are deeply connected to one another and to engineering culture, which, through the process of engineering education, become conditioned in you as part of your professional culture. These concepts are rigor, hierarchies of knowledge, and depoliticization. We are going to start with rigor as it is understood by Donna Riley. Rigorous standards for design, research, and labor are constructed within engineering culture and education and are continuously drawing disciplinary boundaries. The first two words that come to mind when I hear rigor are inflexible and hard. This brings to mind the idea that engineering is considered a hard skill. Have you heard that before? An interviewee mentioned it in their interview. I also think the complexity and rigor of engineering makes it very susceptible to focusing on technical classes. Like, we would always like to take more classes and have more options, but the fact of the matter is, you only have X number of hours in a day, right? So it would be great to have flexibility, but I do see why engineers specifically don't have a ton of it. So here we have the rigor of engineering, making time for some things and not others, based on how rigorous they are deemed to be, based on what is considered disciplinary specific to engineering, based on what is important to engineering. I want you to think about two things. One, what are the skills that are opposite to hard skills? And two, who decides what is important? These decisions about what is considered rigorous or not lead me to my second concept, knowledge hierarchies. They are rooted in epistemological biases, maintained by rigor and reproduced by neoliberalism, and result in the marginalization and undervaluation of soft skills and knowledge. Dr. Kerrigan recently published a paper titled Majorism that examines this in more depth and how these hierarchies operate here at Cal Poly. I want to begin by framing the concept of knowledge hierarchies by exploring some dualisms that are central to the creation of hierarchy. I want to say, in full transparency, that I am critical of all dualisms, as I believe them to be oversimplifications of an incredibly complex world. And not only do I disagree with the ways in which they are considered in opposition to one another, but also with the ways they are considered as separate from one another. There are many implications of these dichotomies, and each one could merit a presentation on its own, so I'm going to be brief. The first of these is the objective-subjective dichotomy, in which objective systems of knowledge production are often valued over subjective ones, and objective fields are considered more rigorous in their methods. What this does is devalue the aspects of knowledge production that are not quantifiable or are less tangible, like lived experience. It also prevents the incorporation of more abstract concepts, of which many of my participants have said the idea of culture is, when explaining their difficulties defining it. There's always some difficulty. Even myself, I have trouble defining it. The second is the technical social dualism, which specifically views the two as separate from one another. And I'm sure if you take a second to think about which career fields get paid more, you can identify how they are valued in relation to one another. In this dichotomy, the technical is seen as objective and not influenced by the social world, when in reality, it is the social world that determines how, what, and why we build the technical world. The processes of design are social, and technologies themselves only have meaning because the social world gives them meaning. Furthermore, to understand why they are differentially valued, I turn to an analysis of motives of neoliberalism. Technological products are more easily given commodity value, more easily applicable to a consumption economy, while products of the social world are less tangible, more relational, and in some respects, antithetical to the individualism neoliberalism demands. And finally, I want to mention the private-public dichotomy, where the two areas are seen as separate and often antagonistic to one another. Increasingly, we see this with the defunding of public goods in favor of letting the private take control. With this, we see private corporations increasing their influence into the systems of knowledge production themselves, and thus, with donations, controlling what is considered important as to meet their own needs. This is one of my participants' responses when I asked about the importance of non-technical education for engineers. I think it definitely depends on what your role is, for sure. With respect to engineering specifically, I really think it depends on what you're working on. If you're working on, if you're building a skyscraper, it's honestly difficult for me to say why you need to understand, for example, structural racism, to be completely honest with you. The influence of these hierarchies has been clear to me in my experience, and in what I have heard from my participants. I'm sure, anecdotally, some of you have even experienced the ranking of specific engineering disciplines against one another. Conscious and unconscious adherence to knowledge hierarchies maintains and establishes disciplinary boundaries, which creates barriers to understanding how different forms of knowledge can be mutually beneficial and necessary to one another. The final aspect of engineering culture I want to discuss is depoliticization. It's a concept that Ketch talks about a lot in her 2014 article. Depoliticization is produced through adherence to paradigms of rigor and hierarchies of knowledge, and acts on behalf of neoliberalism as a means of cultural reproduction. One of my participants explained the basic ideology behind depoliticization perfectly, saying, I think engineering and STEM, more broadly, both have this kind of they don't want to be seen as having a culture. They want to be seen as objective science and technology. That's the view that they try to promote. So what exactly is depoliticization? Put simply, it arises from the view that science is objective, and it separates technology from political context, obfuscating how the political is both part of technical products and is designed by technical products. The process of depoliticization is often implicit in engineering culture. However, it serves the goals of broader forces that shape engineering culture in a much more explicit way. One of these goals is apparent in the implication depoliticization has for how we approach problems. This is with regards to the view that technology is separate from the political, steers our society towards techno-fixes that often act as band-aids and cover up the deeper structural issues. In doing this, we don't question how problems we are attempting to fix began or how they're perpetuated, and we leave those structures in place and risk reinforcing them. The second implication is that this marginalizes those who are interested in doing technical work that is clearly social, thus limiting the possibilities for more inclusive and just engineering practices, and further drawing lines between who does what work and what can and cannot be done with technical work. So, finally, how do these aspects of engineering culture impact our club? I argue we should look at the predominant organization of our club to answer that. Until recently, almost every team broke up their members into 3 separate sections: technical, cultural, fundraising. Now these areas touch, but often I've found they don't overlap in a meaningful way. With some background on where I'm coming from and the concepts that are framing my work, I want to get into some of my findings. Following a statistical analysis of survey results, I will present full-length quotes of my participants. The quotes are long, but I believe this is the best way to present them and reduce the risk of obscuring what was shared with me. To begin, I want to look at how benefit from EWB projects is understood. Overall, those surveyed were almost evenly split on their beliefs about whether students or communities benefited most from EWB projects. Within this split, higher averages for rankings of the importance of technical factors were marginally significant in predicting the response that communities benefit more from projects. More simply put, the higher you were to rank the importance of technical factors, the more likely you were to believe that communities are benefiting more than Cal Poly students. Additionally, both more years in EWB and higher reported percentage of meetings spent talking about non-technical factors were significant in predicting the opposite conclusion about who benefits most, with both predicting the response that student participants in EWB benefit more. From my initial analysis of interviews, my interview participants are similarly split. And it's a lot more complex than just that black and white, I think, and a lot of them have alluded to that as well. However, the statistical results I just went over indicate at least this. Cultural education and greater time in EWB generates critical thought about the dispersion of benefit from our projects. So why does this matter? I think the following response from an interview participant addresses this question beautifully. The main beneficiaries of these projects are students, and it's often students learning at the expense of these community members, because often these projects don't function as they're supposed to. It doesn't work. But when you affect the emotions of a person like that, like promise them we're going to give you water, and then you don't, you fail, and you're like, that's it. And if this happens repeatedly, and this does happen repeatedly, in communities where people came in and promised the world and they don't deliver, and then after time, I just imagine, well, I don't know the effects that could cause a person at an individual level or at a societal level. I just imagine it's not good. And I agree. Benefit at the expense of others is inherently exploitative. And I argue that if we, students in the global north, are benefiting through the gaining of skills and experience, we are benefiting under a paradigm of neoliberal individualism, where we are increasing our value in the labor market and economy. And this economy is dependent on the exploitation of the global south, and is an economy that's existence is undeniably related to the environmental and economic reasons that underlie the very need for our projects. Next, I want to look at, as a club, how we view the importance of culture. So, in my statistical analysis, I asked what influenced responses regarding how participants ranked the importance of non-technical factors to project success, versus how they ranked technical factors to project success. The measure of importance was calculated by having participants rank 6 factors: materials, engineering design, implementation, cultural competency, community needs, and the political and economic conditions of that community. The ranking of the first 3 factors, materials, design, and implementation, composed the average ranking of the importance of technical factors. And the latter 3, cultural competency, community needs, and political and economic conditions, composed the average ranking of the importance of non-technical factors. What survey results establish is 1, if participants indicated higher interest in learning about non-technical factors of a project, this was statistically significant in predicting a higher average ranking of the importance of non-technical factors. And this is a point I'm going to come back to in a little bit. And 2, higher rankings for both the importance of engineering competency to project success and the value placed on engineering knowledge were marginally significant in predicting lower average rankings for the importance of non-technical factors. And this might make sense. But what is interesting about the second point is that questions measuring how participants ranked the importance of cultural competency and how valuable they considered cultural knowledge had no effect at all on average rankings of the importance of technical factors. I argue these findings, and lack of findings, support my hypothesis that the entrenchment of knowledge hierarchies in engineering education produces barriers to the true incorporation of non-technical factors into project design. So how exactly are non-technical factors important to design? Again, I will first let one of my participants answer this question. We can always work with the engineering to change it to meet their needs, but we don't want them to have to change to meet our engineering design. That just seems backwards, you know? But when you're actually working on the project, it's way easier said than done. It's like we're engineers. They teach us this in design classes. We tend to fall in love with our ideas and stuff, and our designs. And we try to brush off criticisms like they're not real. EWB, it's like that is just what happens all the time. What I see as most enlightening about this participant's response is first the immediate understanding that it is on us to change our designs. But it is then followed up with analysis of how that is hard. The belief that what you are doing and how you are doing it is correct is ingrained in you during your education. You get good grades for it. You do well. You're doing exactly what you were taught to. And then, with regards to the brushing off of criticisms, which are later on in the interview explained to be coming from the community or non-technical experts, this is an example of how different knowledge types are differentially valued. Finally, this participant subtly points to 3 things I argue signal the importance of culture to design. 1, that technology is produced within culture. Therefore, it reflects the values and systems of that culture. We produce technology with and for peoples outside of our culture. It is their systems and values that our design should reflect. And finally, culture is embedded in design processes and products. It is more than tangential knowledge, it shapes our knowledge. Therefore, as designers, we should operate within frameworks of justice, autonomy, and care in order to make sure that we respect those we work with and work for. The final part of my findings I want to touch on before moving into an analysis of the specific structures and systems I believe are creating barriers to creating projects that are wholly committed to these frameworks is whether we are truly incorporating non-technical factors rather than simply recognizing their importance on a superficial level. I ran 2 tests to explore what relationship education about non-technical factors in project meetings had on member beliefs about the importance of cultural competency and the value of cultural knowledge. The first of these tests is shown now. There's a significant relationship between a higher percentage of meetings spent discussing non-technical factors and a higher ranking of the importance of cultural competency to project success. The same relationship is true with even higher significance for the value placed on cultural knowledge. And additionally, overall, almost every respondent to the survey said that they valued cultural knowledge and believed cultural competency were important to project success very highly. However, I argue these responses say more about recognition than incorporation. This belief is based on my own experience and what I have heard from interview participants. The following quote is an example of this. This participant was sharing a story from the end of Crash Course, where they gave a survey asking new members what they wanted to do in the club, stating that they didn't just have to pick one of the options, but 90% of everyone clicked engineering, and then I think 15% clicked business, and 10% clicked cultural type stuff. I argue this incongruity highlights the disconnect between recognizing and truly understanding one, like I mentioned, sharing my experiences, how to incorporate non-technical knowledge, and understanding that until recently I lacked fully, and 2, the importance of incorporating these factors, the true importance and what it means. Additionally, I see this disconnect again in some of my interview participants when they are asked about the importance of culture. Engineers have to work around or work with the culture for it to work, because engineering is supposed to be creating solutions for problems that people have, and if the problems are strictly technical, then maybe you cannot really consider culture. A lot of the times, however, the problems are because it involves humans, therefore it's considered a cultural aspect. So if your technical solution doesn't fit with the cultural problem, then it won't solve it. For me, this quote highlights a number of things. 1, the belief, one that I have talked to previously, that culture is something outside of our work, an element to be worked around, and something that is influential to, but not critically embedded in our projects. 2, the prevalence of the social technical dualism. 3, the disciplinary lines drawn around who does what work. And finally, that culture is seen as something important, although at a surface level. I fully believe, with evidence described above to support me, that cultural education is important. And I want to highlight some of the ways in which this club and the members of this club are taking really laudable steps towards incorporation. These include, to name only a few, the creation and maintenance of the Critical Global Engagement Club, EWB Speaker Series, Coffee Talks, and Crash Course, and the promotion of EDGE courses. However, unfortunately, I must argue that these are not enough alone. Members likely to engage in these clubs may already be interested in learning about non-technical factors related to development, and as shown earlier, those more interested already rank the importance of non-technical factors relatively higher. So, this brings me to the final part of my presentation, a discussion about the 3 structural barriers to incorporation of the non-technical that I identify as limiting to the capabilities of education alone to bring about projects that through transdisciplinary work can be just, decolonial, and more fully for and with the communities. The first of these is the most entrenched in our broader society, and therefore the least likely place to create immediate interventions: neoliberalism. Foremost, neoliberalism, at least in part, generates the need for our projects by structuring global levels of inequality. Furthermore, it creates development as an industry that, whether for profit or not, we operate within. When I asked interviewees about why EWB exists, this was one of the responses, and it's not the only of its kind. Tax write-offs for corporations like Chevron and Boeing, who donate huge amounts, and as an avenue for us to train to work in this corporate machine that they kind of send us to. As I mentioned earlier when discussing benefit, our benefit prepares us for the neoliberal and corporate world. Again, this is evidenced here. Next, neoliberalism influences agendas through funding, and such funding moves less from the public sector and more towards the private. This is clearly influential in EWB when considering what the club focuses on. A participant told the story about discussing with a faculty member how to approach corporate donors. I was like, so we're going to show them we've implemented all these projects, we've impacted this many people. And she's like, okay, that's all great, that's nice, but that's not really what they care about. They're going to donate when they want you to go work for them. Clearly, the impetus for doing these projects, at least for donors, is not the people we impact, but what we are gaining from the experience. Undeniably, these facets of neoliberalism then bleed into the next structural constraint I want to discuss. Engineering education. As a system, this is a place in which, at least at Cal Poly, interventions can and are being made. Two consequences of engineering education I want to highlight are as follows. The first being that what is taught is what becomes important. And with regards to culture and how it constructs our world, that is often what is left out. As a participant put it, we're not taught to think about those social implications in our classes, so why would we think about them when we're working on a project? The next influence I want to touch on is related, and that is the enculturation of best practices in engineering. So things like meeting deadlines on time, maintaining budgets at all costs, delegating tasks, and doing rigorous work that clearly contributes to the overall goal. Speaking to that last point, a participant said this with respect to why less new members are interested in doing non-technical work. If you're joining a team and you're only going to be doing presentations to your group, that doesn't seem like as applicable to a project as working on the system design. Finally, I argue that neoliberalism and engineering education reinforce the final barrier, and the barrier at which I believe we can make the most impact as a club. Disciplinary boundaries. In our club, I argue that disciplinary boundaries define who does what work and favor role allocation over collaboration in an interdisciplinary setting, rather than setting us up for a transdisciplinary setting where we're all learning from each other and with each other. These two products of disciplinary boundaries create feelings of disconnect for members who may do more non-technical work, and may in fact explain why it is hard for EWB to retain members who are interested in that work. At least this is what was the explanation provided by one of my participants. When I asked why retention is an issue, they stated, people kind of want to hear exactly why they would be helpful, what the purpose of them being in the club would be. We need to work to help people, see that not just engineers.